shows basically showcasing all of Missouri Civil War sites, but in northeast Missouri and southeast Missouri, and soon in the Boot Heel. Grant wasn't in the Boot Heel, but his troops were in the Boot Heel during the Battle of Belmont. That we're going to be able to trace all the places he was from 1861 to 1862, and then all the places he was around St. Louis before and after the Civil War. And just so you understand, the tourism aspect of it is the one I guess that gets most visibility, but we also are involved in preservation projects and battlefield archaeology. Actually, our board of directors is a group of archaeologists. We'll have a little to talk about if you have some questions about the Battle of Moore's Mill. I don't know if y'all ever heard of that. That's up in Callaway County. And that is now on the National Register of Historic Places, and hopefully it's going to get preserved. But then I might say that before we did the Grant Trail, we did the Gray Ghost Trail, which is kind of our southern version. And we're still working on getting people to get on board with that in a bigger way. But I'm here today to talk to you about Ulysses S. Grant, which is, I'm very, very happy to be here to talk to him because I think he is the most important personage that Missouri has ever produced. And I say Missouri produced him because a lot of you may have been somewhere and gone to school somewhere else and then settled for the rest of your life on a particular place like St. Genevieve. Well, the same was pretty much for Grant. And of course, he married into a family in St. Louis. He had some other things on his plate for the next 20 or so years, but he always came back to St. Louis and to Whitehaven. And that is partly the inspiration for us getting to know Grant a little better and telling our neighbors what they have to see here. But now, into the travel log portion of this thing, I want to first of all start about as far northeast Missouri as you can get, and certainly as far as you can get and still see some of Grant. And what you have here is an old woodcut that shows the town of Monroe City, Missouri, in the very northeast corner of Monroe County. I don't know if any of you have been up that direction. It was called Monroe Station at the time of the Civil War. And like a lot of towns in Missouri, it had just cropped up because they had just built the railroad there. In this case, it was the Hannibal and St. Joe. And what part it plays in the life of Ulysses Grant was that. Grant had, after some struggles to get a command, Grant always had troubles, it seems. He got command of the 21st Illinois Infantry. He trained them in Springfield, and as July 1861 approached, he marched them off to get close to the action, and the action then was in Missouri. Grant marched his men, even though a railroad at the time ran from Springfield to Quincy. He marched the men across Illinois till he got to the Illinois River, about a place called Naples today, and went into camp. And there he waited for a steamship that was supposed to come up and get his regiment and take them down to St. Louis, down further than that, down to Ironton. Now we all know Grant spent some time in Ironton, but originally he was going to be there right smack out of Illinois. But in Monroe City, there was another colonel of another Illinois regiment who basically did the same thing. He just came in to Missouri. It was the 16th Illinois Regiment, and a guy named Smith, as I recall. He marched out inland from the river and went scouting around for the Missouri State Guard, who were rumored to be camped there. Forgot one important thing that probably even he learned later is that if you take your men and your supplies and everything else out on a railroad, my goodness, leave some people there to guard those supplies. But he did not. And so the State Guard came, they surrounded the town. He got back to Monroe City, and that building that was in the background was an old building called the Academy. And he and the 16th Illinois holed up there for a day, were bombarded, and finally got relieved. And that was the end of that incident. But it was the beginning of U.S. Grant's career as a Civil War soldier, because instead of going to Ironton, incidentally, the steamboat ran aground on its way up to Naples, Illinois. He was rushed over to Missouri. He did put his men on the trains then at Naples, and he got to Quincy, and he actually got over on the Missouri side of the Mississippi River that very day, and he marched in the direction of Monroe City. By the time he got there, that incident was over, and so Grant, this is I think the State Historical Society put this up in the 1930s. This is on a conservation area west of Hannibal, west of Monroe City, called Honeywell. The Honeywell. The State Guard troops had destroyed a bridge on the Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad over the Salt River there, and so Grant spent about a week or two while that bridge was being repaired. And in the meantime, I'm going to point it over here now. He visited Florida, Missouri. I'm going to get back to that, but I don't. Do y'all know what this is a picture of? If you've got the maps you handed out, you can look and you can get the answer. But this is a place called Graceland that's in Mexico, Missouri. And fortunately, the Longstreet County Historical Society preserved that house. It was built, it was in 1858 or 1859, and now that houses the Longstreet County Historical Society. We know that while Grant was stationed in Mexico, he went from the Salt River up near Monroe City down to Mexico was his next station. And there is where he learned that he had become a general in the United States Volunteer Army. And during those 2 weeks, his men, he had control of 3 regiments there, and his men were trying to control some of the hooliganism, let's say, along the North Missouri Railroad, where bridges were being burned, much of that sort of thing. Whoops, that's too far. While he was camped there, he took his troops and he pitched a tent, and I believe very fine authority has it that it was right here next to the brand new Casey's General Store. But at least we know where it is, and we're trying to talk to Casey's General Store to get a sign there, and that's the tourism part of it, but so far, not yet. This is an image that is, of course, one of those old 1869 aerial town images that is on a educational panel we now have up in Graceland, and that shows where the Graceland is, and that shows where Casey's General Store is actually. And I guess you all know who this man is. That is Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain. Now, in northeast Missouri, and that's not to say in this neck of the woods we don't have plenty of interesting stories, but in northeast Missouri, of course, if you can tie anything from a tourism standpoint to this man, well, you've got yourself a story. But fortunately, indeed, they are tying this man to General Grant because many of you may have heard the story, but there is a short story that Mark Twain wrote in the 1890s called A Private History of the Campaign That Failed. Now, keep in mind, it is Mark Twain, and keep in mind, secondly, that Ulysses Grant was dead by that time. As many of you may know, Mark Twain and Ulysses Grant became friends, quite good friends, later in their lives. And in fact, it was Twain who owned a publishing company, or owned part of a publishing company, that bugged him and bugged him and bugged him, I mean Ulysses Grant, to write his memoirs. And ultimately he agreed he would do that. Twain gave him a good deal, and as we all know, well actually 130 years ago, as of about 2 weeks ago, passed away having just completed his memoir. That was at the time the best-selling work of nonfiction in the history of the United States, and it kept Julia Grant in some comfort for the rest of her life. But in 1861, according to the private history of the campaign that failed, Samuel Clemens had joined up with a group of his buddies who formed a company with the Missouri State Guard, and they were traipsing around, and this is true, they were, with the State Guard Army of Thomas, Grant, while he was up at the Salt River Bridge, conducted his very first overland campaign as a Civil War officer by marching, 15 or 20 miles, looking for Thomas Harris was the name of the general. His camp that was purported to be down in the Salt River down near Florida, which just happened to be, of course, Mark Twain's birthplace. This is a commemorative stone up there at Florida now, and this is a portion of a famous quote from Grant's memoirs, returning now to the memoirs. Grant walked over a hill on his march down to Florida. He saw that ultimately the camp was abandoned, and he said that his heart resumed its place in his chest, but that he learned a valuable lesson from that incident, which was that his enemy was always as afraid of him as he was of his enemy. And I think he said that he took that with him the rest of his life. But anyway, to put the capstone on the question of Mark Twain, it was about 2 weeks that he was in the Missouri State Guard or affiliated with it. He was perhaps at the camp on the Salt River in Florida, but perhaps not. But by, July 25th, 1861, I might say Grant, Monroe City was July 10th, 1861. Grant arrived in Missouri right about that time, and so this is 2 weeks after that. This is a copy of the ticket that Twain's brother Orion had bought for a stage ride for him and his brother out to Nevada, where Grant went on to some fame. But that is the ticket by which Samuel Clemens left Missouri, and it was the basis of the book Roughing It that took out to Nevada. So anyway, now down to southeast Missouri. I'm going to skip her a little around geographically, but trying to keep it intact chronologically. Have you all, well, I should ask, this is kind of like the debate the other night. Who has not been to the Catholic Church in Ironton to see the spring where Grant camped? Okay, so only a couple of you have not been. Okay, good. Well, I'll address my remarks to you all. I was here in all seriousness. This is the place where Grant received his orders, his commission. He'd been appointed as general, and of course I encourage Mexico and Ironton to fight about which was more important. And I might add that in the process of all this, Grant was also in Jefferson City for about a week. And it was from Jefferson City that he actually wrote and accepted his commission as Brigadier General. But here is on the grounds of the St. Marie de la Catholic Church, the gazebo. I don't know how long that iteration of it has been, but behind it is the monument a single Union soldier that is at the spot purportedly of the Grant Oak, where Grant spent a little less than 2 weeks commanding troops in southeast Missouri before he was pulled out of there and sent to Jefferson City. And that was dedicated a year after his death. It was dedicated in 1886 and is still very, very well cared for. This is a picture of a gazebo that stood on the same place as of 1906. Now we're going to move into back up to St. Louis, and chronologically that's where we need to go. But I wanted to tell the rest of the story about the Ironton Spring. There was at that time, fairly young lawyer who had just moved to Ironton, who went to see Grant when he came to town, and I guess everybody thinks that lawyers know everything, but Grant asked the lawyer if he had any maps of the area of southeast Missouri, and the lawyer sure enough did. And so now this is all according to the lawyer, so now I've just questioned the credibility of Mark Twain. Now I'm into lawyers, but so he brought Grant a map, and Grant sat at his table under the Grant Oak and worked diligently for days. And when the lawyer saw the map again, he saw that he had made X's and that he had basically designed a campaign that would go down the Mississippi and up the Tennessee River and of course on to Pickering. Well, now the lawyer was quite a fan of Grant, and I suppose having had that connection early in the war, he remained a lifelong fan. And in the 1890s, he wrote a series of magazine articles in which he explained what had happened, and he related, I do need to go back, that not only had Grant planned the invasion of the South there in Ironton, but at one point he walked up to the spring that still flows next to that gazebo, and he said, now I'm paraphrasing, but that spring flows into the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi flows into the Gulf of Mexico, and I shall follow that water to the Gulf, something to that effect. Well, the lawyer was a guy named John Wesley Emerson. And John Wesley Emerson was actually a distant relative of the Emersons of Massachusetts. And not that he made a great deal of money in Ironton as a lawyer, but he got something of an inheritance later. He moved to St. Louis. He actually rose to Marshal of the Eastern District of Missouri, but also had a law practice. And he had two young men working for him, kind of like lawyers today would have paralegals, and they were investigators. And one day they came to him and they said, Mr. Emerson, we want to start a company, and could you loan us money or could you invest in it? And yes, he did. And the company was an electrical company. And in fact, so they named it Emerson Electric Company after their benefactor. Emerson did have a bit of a war record. He rose, I think, a major in the 47th Missouri Infantry, and was in the 47th at that time. It was about now this is the old planter's house in St. Louis, and those of you familiar with downtown, you can barely see in this picture, but there's an iron fence along the side of it, and that is the iron fence that still stands today that surrounds the old courthouse. The planter's house was just to the north of that. It's where what we used to call the Boatman's Bank building now stands, but I can't keep track. I don't know what it's called today. But the planter's house was, I think it's fair to say, U.S. Grant's favorite hotel of all time, perhaps except for the Willard in Washington after he became president. But Grant would come every chance he got to stay in the planters before the war or after the war. In fact, he stayed there the night before his wedding in 1848 and walked down the street to where his in-laws' city house was to get married. And he also, well, I have to tell a little story about a game of brag now that I mentioned the Grant's wedding. Brag is was a sort of an ancient form of poker that was played with 3 cards. I never tried to play it myself, but if you say poker, I got some general idea what it was. But it was apparently a fairly popular game among Army guys back then. And in about 1858 or 1859, I think I'm getting ahead of myself again. According to what was reported by future Confederate General James Longstreet, Longstreet, and a couple of other Army officers were in a room in the Planters Hotel playing a game of brag. Well, they had 3 people and they needed a 4th. James Longstreet, turns out, was kin to Julia Denton, a cousin of Julia Denton. In fact, Longstreet had been a groomsman at Grant's wedding in 1848. But in any case, someone walked out of the Planters Hotel, walked down the street looking for a 4th player, and see some guy walking up the street who's none other than Ulysses Grant in his somewhat shabby civilian clothing in a period of time that was just about the lowest point he had reached. And so they brought him in and bragged with him, and ultimately, as he left, he pressed a coin into Longstreet's hand and said, "I owe you this." Now, Grant owed everybody. He owed Longstreet that $5, $20, whatever, since West Point, and he wanted to have it. And Longstreet, and frankly, Longstreet, on the day after Grant died in 1885, Longstreet was interviewed by the New York Times, and then told the story at that time about the game of brag. And as he said, the next time he saw Ulysses S. Grant was at Appomattox. So, and I think we will come back to that. I think I'm going to move through this because I want to leave some time for questions. But this is, there's a great thing that's on display at the Missouri History Museum in St. Louis right now. Compton and Dry, this is purportedly, and since it's a Missouri thing, I'm going to say it's absolutely the finest 18th century, 19th century map of any city in the world, which 2 guys sat and drew every building in what was then the extent of St. Louis. And this is, I put this up to kind of illustrate. Well, a couple of the times that Grant was in St. Louis in 1861, he had been in Mexico. He was sent down to Ironton. He came back to St. Louis and then was sent to Jefferson City. But I'm going to get around here to a date in late August of 1861. A couple of stories about John C. Fremont and Army headquarters in St. Louis. So bear with me for a minute. But first of all, you saw the little circle up here. This is, according to Compton and Dry's work, this is 8th and Shoto. This would once be known, no longer is, I guess, but this was once Checkerboard Square. And this building is no longer there, but this was the home of a relative of John Fremont's wife, Jessie Benton, which sort of began Fremont's trouble because he paid an exorbitant price of government money, of course, to make it his headquarters. This is incidentally a painting on glass that is in the Corning Museum of Glass in New York. And it is a painting of the Grant's mansion. There's also a photograph that's around. But, and this here is the old Pacific Railroad terminal. And I guess I wanted to point out that in between those two places is what was once the St. Louis Medical College that became the infamous Gratiot Street Prison. And I say that because I think I can skip more of that. I'm going to talk a little about Cape Girardeau because this past January, actually on the anniversary of the day in 1862, the Grant issued the order for all of the Union armies to move forward. Grant did, Samuel Curtis did, everybody west of the Mississippi did exactly what Lincoln ordered, and it resulted in the Battle of Fort Donelson, the Battle of Pea Ridge, and the capture of Paducah, Kentucky for one. But everybody moved out here, and of course, as we all know, General McClellan in the East just sat still until the following March. But in January of 1862, I've gotten off track here a little bit. Let me get you back to August of 1861. One of my favorite stories about Grant, and it relates a little bit to the Pliner's house as well. That last picture I showed. So Grant goes to Ironton. Grant is there a little over a week, maybe a week and a half. And the train arrives, and some guy named Benjamin Prentiss gets off the train, and he has orders that he is to relieve Grant. Benjamin Prentiss was a native of Quincy, Illinois, and he and several other Illinois politicians all received their commissions to be brigadier generals effective the same day, along with Ulysses Grant. And so Prentiss gets off the train. Grant doesn't know what to do, but the orders say come back to St. Louis. So Grant goes back to St. Louis. He goes to that headquarters on Choteau Avenue, and he's given orders to go to Jefferson City. He spends 1 week in Jefferson City, gets orders there. Now I'm going to tell, this story is told a little bit in the panel that's now in front of the Hammond Police Courthouse, but there are two versions of the story. I'll give you the one I like the most first, and I'll give you the one that's probably the truth. But according to the one I like the most, that is reflected in the record, Grant's orders when he was relieved then in Jefferson City was report to St. Louis for order. He gets on the train from Jefferson City, he arrives there, walks up the hill, past the Gratiot Street Prison to the headquarters, and he goes and sits in the basement of the Grant Mansion, where was essentially the waiting room for anybody who wanted to see General Fremont. An old friend from the old Army by the name of Justice McKinstry, that name is probably familiar to some of you because he became famous in a very bad way later in the war. But his old friend McKinstry comes walking through the basement on his way upstairs for a staff meeting with General Fremont, and says, now they called Grant Sam at West Point because of his initials, U.S. And he sees Grant sitting there waiting, and says, Sam, how are you? It's great to see you. Well, he goes up to the staff meeting, and they're discussing the need to send a column down the Mississippi River and basically start the war in southeast Missouri. And according to this story, McKinstry, I don't imagine he stood up, I don't even know. He stood up and he said, wait, I know just the man, it's Sam Grant, and he's waiting downstairs. And this is according to what McKinstry wrote. So they brought him up. They found, yes, this is just the man we need. Long story short, that day, August 28th, 1861, Grant walked over to the Planter's House Hotel. He got a room, he stayed there for 2 days. He hired his most important staff members, And on August 30th, he got on a steamship and he was in Cape Girardeau that night. So the 28th, he arrives from Jefferson City, spends those couple days at the planner's house, gets on a boat, and in the evening of August 30th, he's in Cape Girardeau. Now, Benjamin Prentiss comes back to haunt him. And this, of course, this is on the seawall or the river wall. And this is a somewhat fanciful rendition of the confrontation between Ulysses Grant and Benjamin Prentiss when, on September 2nd, 3 days into Grant's stay in Cape Girardeau, Prentiss comes riding into town, having been ordered there from Ironton, and Grant sees him riding into town, and as Grant relates in his memoirs, he rides around, catches up with the head of the column, and says essentially, "Prentiss, what are you doing here?" And Prentiss says, "Well, wait a minute." It goes back to the old argument about who was the senior general. "I rank you," et cetera, et cetera. And Grant said, "No, you don't. The orders were you were to stay in Jackson. Now get your men back there." Well, Prentiss didn't want to go back. He asked Grant to place him under arrest, and Grant would not do that, and so Prentiss placed himself under arrest. And so he could go back to St. Louis and plead that, yes, indeed, he was. Now, this was not an unusual occurrence in September 1861 that people wanted to fight, but I do want to point out something about Grant's traits. Prentiss, and as I've read about it now, Prentiss was not the hero of Shiloh, and not of the Hornet's Nest in Shiloh. And I think his self-promotion machine might have gotten a little bit ahead of everybody else's. But Benjamin Grierson was one of the men who stood in the Hornet's Nest and saved Grant's behind just 7 months after that meeting in Cape Girardeau. And now here's another person, and I've got as a backdrop, of course, the same scene with the Grant Mansion. This man is a man by the name of Benjamin Grierson. Who's heard of Benjamin Grierson? Yeah. Hey, tell us who Benjamin Grierson.
He was a cavalry commander that raided into Mississippi, and he was from Illinois. He ended up being River Army after or in command of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, which was a black regiment.
Yes, as Gary had mentioned, this is the guy famous for Grierson's raid into Mississippi in 1863. It was before Vicksburg, and some people will say it was the longest cavalry raid. Well, no, Shelby raid in 1863 was the longest raid. But I think, Gary, the only thing you left out is that Grierson was played by John Wayne in the movie Horseland.
Yeah, Horseland.
Okay. Now everybody knows that. Well, on September 6, 1861, and I'll leave a little bit of the backdrop, go back to Grant at Cape Girardeau. He comes into town on the 28th. He leaves for Cape Girardeau on the 30th. He has a fight with Prentiss on September 2nd. And on September 5th, the Confederates have invaded Kentucky and violated Kentucky neutrality. And on September 5th, Grant is standing on the wharf in Paducah, Kentucky, a week after coming to St. Louis and getting into the war. So on the next day, on the 6th, Benjamin Grierson is at Fremont's headquarters pleading the case for Benjamin Grierson. He's up there waiting in the basement of the Brant house like so many other offers. Actually, William T. Sherman relates in his memoirs about waiting in the basement. In Grierson's case, he waited in the basement all day because this particular day, September 6, 1861, the Prince Napoleon of France was visiting St. Louis. if you can believe it. And it was true. You can read up, there's an old printed version in the American Heritage magazine from the 1950s that gives this whole description, because he was a cousin of the then Napoleon III or something like that, but he was called the Prince. And he was touring the U.S. right in the middle of all this stuff. So Fremont had gone to visit the Prince, and Grierson, as I said, never got to see him. And that's our other friend. Well, I think the last time, how you guys doing? You want to hear one more story? Yeah. All right, okay, then I'll read questions. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I've written a national icon. This gets a little closer to home. Anybody tell me what that is?
Old Abe.
Old Abe. Good answer. Now, just as I started to talk by talking about how Ulysses Grant really belongs to Missouri, despite who else wants to claim him, I'm here to tell you that Old Abe and the Screaming Eagle of the 101st Airborne Division also belongs to Missouri. Okay. And you ask me why? Well, I don't know, let me explain. First of all, this is a picture, oops. This is a drawing that was drawn in St. Louis on October 14, 1861 by a newspaperman who actually had followed the 8th Wisconsin Regiment from Chicago, where they had made something of a sensation with their pet eagle, which they named Old Abe. And so they were organized in Madison, Wisconsin. The Eagle got a little press up there, it got more press in Chicago, and so basically the newspapers were waiting for it to arrive, and they did arrive, and I think, I apologize, it was October 14, 1861. And I can remember that date because something very, very important happened on October 15, 1861, which was that Meriwether Jefferson Thompson arrived outside of DeSoto, Missouri, and destroyed a railroad bridge and sent the entire Eastern Missouri Command in a panic on October 15, 1861. So the 8th Wisconsin got to St. Louis on the 14th. They went and marched out to Benton Barracks in North St. Louis. Actually, they lost Old Abe for a little while on the march. They got him back, and then the very next night they were camping in the rain in DeSoto, trying to chase Jeff Thompson back south. The consequence of that particular happening was that on October 21, 1861, the 8th Wisconsin wound up being the rawest Union regiment to arrive in Fredericktown, Missouri, still chasing Jeff Thompson south after the northernmost point he reached in DeSoto. And they converged there, and of course, there was a battle in Fredericktown. This rawest regiment, the 8th Wisconsin, was sent to the back to where the courthouse is to guard the trains, and they had with them their eagle, Old Abe. So one of the men tethered him to the courthouse roof while the battle was going on, and then the men noticed that the eagle, and actually I've read that the eagle may have been a female. Let's hope so. But the eagle started flapping its wings and screeching and crying and screaming. And the men noticed this, and so the battle was over, and they went on to the number I've heard, 35 battles that the 8th Wisconsin fought in They say that old Abe himself was wounded 2 or 3 times. There's a famous incident down in Corinth, Mississippi, where, in fact, General Sterling Price is quoted as saying that I'd rather get that eagle than a whole regiment of troops, because the eagle would fly over the Confederate formations and would screech and cry and just spook the daylights out of them. Old Abe went back to Wisconsin. He was the hero. When he died in a courthouse, or I'm sorry, in a state house fire, they stuffed him and put him on a perch to overlook the Wisconsin legislature. And he did until the state house burned again, and he burned up. But to this day, there is a bronze eagle that is perched that oversees the workings of the Wisconsin legislature. Now, this is kind of around World War I, there was a National Guard unit based in Milwaukee that had a numerical designation of 101st Regiment. And they adopted the Screaming Eagle as their mascot. And that unit was called up in World War II, and suggested, they were told that they were going to learn to be airborne troops, and they, along with the 87, trained to become airborne troops. And it is that reason that patch is probably worn to this day by veterans who aren't pretty good ones. It was because of Fredericktown. Anyway, there probably is more stuff. Oh, and just to say, this is, I have to say this. As I drove down here from St. Louis, I drove by Imperial and a town that's south of Barnhart. And of course, anytime I drive past those places, I look off to my left, driving south, and say, wow, that's where Camp Curtis was. Well, there is, in fact, a road. If you get off of the Barnhart exit, it goes about 3/4 of a mile up. There's a road called Sulphur Springs Road. And you can take that down to the river, and it's actually a very cute little town, what's left of it. But this is a map from 1861. I think this will, no, see, I told you there was more you don't have to see. After Fredericktown, the 8th Wisconsin was sent to Ironton, and essentially they had duty along the Iron Mountain Railroad all the way from Sulphur. Oh, thank you very much. From Sulphur Springs, which was a steamboat landing, and just north of where the railroad turned in. So it was a place that became quite an important supply depot. The 8th Wisconsin, along with the 11th Wisconsin Regiment, were sent to Sulphur Springs, and they spent the winter from sometime in November until late January of 1862, camped right there. And they were joined by a battalion of Wisconsin cavalry as well. So basically, I've been telling the people of Jefferson County that help us get a sign up there, help us preserve this place, and you can put a cheese shop over on Highway 61 and you'll make a fortune. But anyway, that is that close, and it's that important that we preserve places like Sulphur Springs. Well, I'd say that's concludes my talk, and it's great to be in St. Genevieve as always. I promise